Got to do all the Teams things first. There we go. A lot of clicking.
Well done, Julia. Thank you for the introduction, and well done setting all the tech up. I'm not going to touch it because I will break something. I'm not going to touch it. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mike Duisberg. I'm the chair of the Auckland Branch Committee of the Resource Management Law Association. Pleasure to welcome you along tonight, and I will be the MC for this evening's presentation. My plan is to talk as little as possible, but I'll just be here to rein you folks in if things get out of control in the questions. Look, in terms of what we're going to cover tonight, I'll introduce our speakers very briefly shortly, but we're just going to try and get into the content. But we've got three presentations, one from each of our speakers that they'll take you through, and then we've got time for a panel discussion and kind of questions at the end. As Julia mentioned, we do have microphones. We've got some that Julia can carry around. We've also got the Boffin-Miskell box one that we can actually throw around. It's not a throwing and catching test, but it's just a little bit of fun. So we'll do that if we need to. Because we're going to have the panel discussion at the end, please do save your questions for the end. We'll just cover them all off together. It'll be fun. And yeah, that's the program. So before I leave you, the speakers tonight and their order will start with Dr. Stacey Vallis, who will go first, followed by Amanda Mulligan at the far end, and then our very own Heike Lutz. I think that's all from me. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stacey.
Thanks very much, Mike, for the warm words. I'm just Stacey. So at that, once again, thanks very much to the RMLA, the Resource Management Law Association, for the opportunity to say a few words this evening. So for those that I don't know, hello, kia ora, I'm Stacey, and I chair ICMOS Aotearoa New Zealand. So on that note, what is heritage? And our heritage stories is hotly debated. And so today I'm here to share a few thoughts around what I think heritage is, along with what I think it's not, and setting myself a strict time frame of tackling 5 heritage myths in 10 minutes. So, okay. Got it. Oh, good. Oh, gosh.
Cool.
Cool.
This, we don't want to miss some pictures. There we go.
Thanks, Julia. Awesome. So let's get started. What is ICMOS? Is it a Greek island? Actually, oh God, what am I doing?
Sorry. The clicker work.
I'll give the clicker.
There we go.
Okay, I will use that. I won't touch the keyboard. All good. So yes, hold that thought. So ICMOS is an acronym that stands for the International Council for Monuments and Sites, which is a non-governmental organization that's focused on the conservation of the world's cultural heritage, based in France, and is supported by its charters, which are essentially guidelines, if you will, for treating and managing different types of cultural heritage. So ICMOS was founded in 1965 and today has over, well, say 10 or 11,000 members in around 150 countries. But up until the 20th century, architectural or cultural heritage was primarily seen as a sort of national concern, with little guidance to address what we now know as a sort of shared or regional cultural heritage. So the Athens Charter and Conference, dating to 1931, introduced this idea of a more global cultural heritage for the first time. And these beginnings were soon followed by the urgent need for guidance to restore urban centers, cities that were damaged or destroyed during the Second World War. And this in turn led to the development of the Venice Charter in 1964. Now, our national chapter at ICMOS Aotearoa New Zealand was established in 1987, and we currently have around 170 members. But at the heart of our work is the ICMOS New Zealand Charter for the conservation of places of cultural heritage value, which again is a set of guidelines used by central and local government, as well as by practitioners, as I'm sure many, or certainly a few in this room will know. So bearing in mind the development of the Venice Charter in 1964 and the ICMOS New Zealand Charter approximately 45 years later, what are some of the key shifts in the conservation theory, principles, practices that have occurred over this time frame? So if we read through some of the key developments that I thought might be useful to point out here, include a focus on the concept of place rather than a single building or monument, along with the significance of local or indigenous cultural heritage values, and also starting to introduce the difference between what we call tangible versus intangible cultural heritage values. So I'll pick up on these ideas briefly in the next few slides, as I know our following speakers will as well. So moving along, myth number 2, all old buildings are cultural heritage. Surely not. So this is a myth. It's true. Not all old buildings are cultural heritage, but there are some unexpected exceptions, like the Big Duck, Long Island. The question for us is on the basis of what criteria is a building designated, or this building designated, a place on the US National Register. Now, to cut a long story short, Big Duck inspired a well-known 20th century architecture design theory, essentially, made famous in the book Learning from Las Vegas, where the authors, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, observed that Big Duck combined both function and symbol in its design. So in other words, a duck-shaped building indicating or highlighting its use or its purpose of selling ducks and eggs. So this historic significance combined with the tangible aspects of it, so looking at the sort of concrete and wire mesh construction of the 1930s, also an example of typical sort of American roadside architecture of the time, contributed to Big Duck's inclusion on the US National Register. Unbelievable, perhaps. But the next time you're in NYC, just remember, Big Duck is only a short 2-hour drive away in Long Island. So from Long Island to Rome and beyond, what about myth number 3? Heritage is historic buildings. You can probably guess my response here. So as much as we hate giving the Aussies credit for anything, an important document in shifting heritage theory is the Australia ICMOS Borough Charter that highlights this concept of place. So here, recognizing or noting that cultural heritage can include buildings, groups of buildings, trees, landscapes, roads, meeting places, and so forth, but basically going beyond the original Eurocentric view of a single classical monument, okay? And we have some fantastic examples of diverse cultural heritage places right here in Aotearoa. One being the Tongariro National Park that was inscribed onto the UNESCO World Heritage List in the 1990s, and was the first property to be inscribed under a revised criterion for what's known as cultural landscapes. So in other words, bringing together the links between people and their natural environment. Number 4, heritage conservation means no change, much like this tribolite fossil. On the contrary, heritage conservation can include many different degrees of change, from preservation all the way through to adaptation, and that can shape its, say, its cultural heritage or its historic authenticity or value. So the NARA document is premised on the need to view cultural heritage sites as a whole, rather than just singular sort of fragments or objects floating in space without context. And in doing so, also highlighting that different cultures view changes or change to historic buildings, sites, or places as part of an overall living, breathing cultural heritage. So heritage is not static, but it is changing, evolving with the times, and that may be demonstrated by change through its physical fabric, such as the bricks, mortar, timber, but also perhaps through changes in its use over time. So last but not least, and speaking of dinosaur fossils, do all heritage practitioners look like this fine gentleman? Maybe, but also not quite. So this is us. Our members include architects, engineers, archaeologists, planners, as well as trades practitioners and students. In recent years, there's been a special focus on fostering dialogue between the voices of experience, but also those that are emerging, and driven by the Emerging Professionals Initiative, where some of the programs or the initiatives include working on research projects, practical projects, to develop heritage conservation guidance locally or internationally, also with outreach together with our partner organizations such as UNESCO, and of course, supported by robust mentorship. So I just quickly say that it's been wonderful to have recently linked up with the young RMLA Auckland, and we're currently having a chat around the opportunity to set up a joint evening like this one for students sometime in early 2025. So watch this space. But in summary, I'll close with 3 key points. One being that not all cultural heritage is a classical temple. This can include buildings, sites, places, big ducks, perhaps. Secondly, we know that change is ongoing, but it can add new layers of significance to our special buildings, sites, and places. And thirdly, just pointing out that successful conservation outcomes require dialogue between the voices of experience, but those that are emerging. And so in this way, we very much view culture and heritage as a platform for the shared dialogue. So that's me. Thanks everyone for listening. Please do get in touch with any questions and we'll have a chat very shortly. Thanks.
Thanks, Stacey. I've got a lot to get through in my 10 minutes, so I don't want to waste too much time introducing myself because the bio got sent around so you can see who I am. And I'm also happy to share the slides after the presentation. So thank you to RMLA for inviting me and allowing me to escape this beautiful heritage building that I spend my work days in. So what I would like to cover tonight is indeed what is heritage, how is it regulated, how much is there that is regulated, and why the heck do we regulate it at all? I personally like to use the term cultural heritage because it's a more inclusive term and it's the term used internationally. It can be used in New Zealand, in my view, erroneously to refer to Māori heritage, but this is the UNESCO definition. The legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that are inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, and bestowed for the benefit of future generations. UNESCO handily have produced this diagram. This is a really Western thing to do, to split cultural heritage up like this, but I do find it handy. So they've split it into the tangible and the intangible that Stacey was talking about. And I guess in the context of RMLA, we're mostly talking about the immovable heritage, historical buildings, monuments, archaeological sites side of things, which is kind of another quite a Western bunch of stuff to identify. So I've just gone ahead and stuck in some other kinds of things that we might see as particularly New Zealand cultural heritage, and I think cultural landscapes in particular was something that the previous slide was missing. I do find that people get confused about the term intangible cultural heritage. So intangible cultural heritage, as you can see on this slide, is things like language, cuisine, art practices, but cultural intangible values are things that movable and immovable heritage items can have. So in terms of a cultural landscape, maybe there's a tipuna maunga that but the value is not necessarily tangible, or a heritage building that has historic value because of an event that occurred or a person that lived there, that's an intangible value of the place. I digress. So the immovable, I personally prefer the term place-based heritage to immovable heritage. Definition that UNESCO has is remarkably similar to the definition of historic heritage that is in the RMA, which is an inclusive definition. And it means those natural and physical resources that contribute to an understanding and appreciation of New Zealand's history and cultures. And these are this is a list of the kinds of things that could be considered historic heritage. It's natural and physical resources, so it could be any aspect of the environment that is historic heritage, land, air, or water. The definition does not limit historic heritage by size, and it does not provide a minimum age. There's no reference to built heritage in the definition. Also really important to point out that archaeological sites are part of the definition of historic heritage in the RMA, meaning that they can be protected under the RMA, as well as be subject to the Archaeological Authority provisions in the Heritage New Zealand Act. It's also really interesting, I think, to think about how those types of heritage listed in the definition overlap. They're not separate kinds of heritage. So now that we've explored what cultural heritage, historic heritage, place-based heritage means, I hope I'm not telling too many people what they already know by just looking a little bit at how heritage is regulated under the RMA. So some of you probably know that the planning legislation, the RMA, is the main tool for regulating heritage in New Zealand. And this means that almost all heritage protection in New Zealand is the domain of councils who implement the RMA. Apart from archaeological authorities, Heritage New Zealand's role is largely as an advocate, not a regulator. They have a list, but this is for information and recognition purposes, and it doesn't have direct regulatory effect. This means that New Zealand's system for regulating heritage is really flat compared to other countries that we compare ourselves with. You look at Australia and the UK, and they have state or national bodies that also have lists, but they also have regulatory powers that protect those places that are used alongside the regulation that councils do. That's very tiny, but that is just pointing out the matters of national importance at the top of the RMA that are particularly relevant to heritage protection, being section 6E, which is about the relationship of Māori to land, and section 6F, which is the protection of the historic heritage. And just linking up to Stacey's point about change, I do think it is important that the word development is literally in section 6F, the matter of national importance, that it contemplates change right up there in the top of the Act. So various layers of government have got responsibilities under the RMA, and central government is responsible for making national direction. It's very little on historic heritage. If there was direction, it might direct what kinds of heritage places to protect or how to balance heritage values with other considerations. There is the New Zealand Heritage List that I mentioned that also sits at the central government level but outside the RMA. The RMA also provides for heritage orders, and these can be required by ministers, by councils, or by Heritage New Zealand, but for various reasons, they've not been really used since the 1990s. Then we get to regional council responsibilities. They make regional plans, but they also develop regional policy statements, which direct how local authorities do heritage. And some of them specifically are quite specific about how the local authorities in their region should assess places for inclusion. But because there's no national direction, each regional policy statement establishes its own framework in the region for managing historic heritage. I'm so stuck in my Wellington world, but the Greater Wellington Regional Council example up there of how they guide places and councils in their regions how to identify heritage, but Auckland also has one, which of course should have been the example that I used, so boo me. Local councils. So this is where the rubber really hits the road when it comes to heritage protection in New Zealand. So they are really giving effect to this whole framework through provisions for heritage in their plans. Usually they do this through schedules of heritage places and rules for how the places in the schedules are managed. All councils in New Zealand already have provisions for heritage, but there's a lot of variance because these provisions have been locally agreed. This means that some plans split and clump types of heritage in different ways. They might have lists of structures, lists of buildings, lists of areas. Some have tiers of A and B or 1 and 2. And it means that there are a real variety of rules, practice and case law has developed without national direction. Heritage New Zealand publishes this triennial report looking at RMA plans and how they provide for heritage. It's a really good resource if you want to understand the variance in plans across the country. This is the latest one from 2022. It also notes the status of each plan, and you can see here that Auckland Council, for example, this is just part of all the lists of council plans, obviously. But Auckland has had numerous plan changes since the unitary plan was introduced in 2016, and I won't particularly name anyone, but a number of the plans just on this page have not been updated for many, many years. I also thought it would be interesting just to look at how much there is. Yes, that was one of the things I was going to look at. So I comparing New Zealand to Victoria. So we've got a reasonably comparable population, a pretty comparable area. There are 15,000 scheduled items roundabout in New Zealand. That figures from the 2022 Heritage New Zealand report, and about 21,000 in Victoria, which makes up 186,000 properties altogether. Some of those 21,000 scheduled items are whole suburbs in Melbourne. The State of Heritage Review was undertaken by the Victorian Heritage Council in 2020, and they reported that that overlay scheme was working well. That was their main conclusion. There has been some sort of similar work undertaken by or published by Auckland Council recently, looking at how much land in some of our centres is protected as heritage, and as you can see, it's everywhere under 1%. Speaking of the Heritage Council work by Auckland Council, it was really good to see some exploration in their latest publication about the benefits of heritage conservation, which brings me to the last thing that I very quickly wanted to cover, which is why do we even regulate this at all? And it's because, linking back to the UNESCO definition at the start, it's because it brings benefits for present and future generations. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, the quantification of those benefits is very infrequently undertaken, but it is more regularly commissioned overseas. So in the UK, there is the annual Heritage Counts report. It has amazing data. These are just a couple of the findings in their previous report. Look, I know we're not the UK, it probably wouldn't be 44.9 billion, but we don't really even ask these questions. And also, Place Economics in the US is a consultancy that I'm familiar with, who get commissioned by a lot of local governments to look at the value of heritage to their cities. So hopefully that has answered my questions that I posed at the start. That heritage under the RMA, it encompasses all types of places and their intangible values. It's a very flat regulatory system that we have in New Zealand. It affects a very small proportion of land, and we do it because it delivers benefits, but unfortunately we don't measure those benefits very often here. That's me.
I will be looking at the practical side of these things that we have heard are very, very difficult at times, and at times not quite hitting the spot. Now, from my point of view, my name is Heike Lutz, by the way. I'm fortunate, I think, that I can actually look through two different lenses when I look at the practice of heritage, because on the one hand, I'm a building conservation consultant. On the other side, I'm a hearings commissioner. And I have both sides of the table in front of me quite regularly. And as someone once said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And it feels a little bit in heritage over the last 30 years, here in New Zealand at least, that this is often the case. Now, generally, as we've heard, there is different definitions of heritage. This is not the general one. This is actually out of a dictionary that has nothing to do with heritage or the ministry or anything else. And we can see that the differences between what the RMA understands as heritage and what the public understands as heritage, and what the day-to-day understanding is when people talk about heritage, that they talk about historic heritage, that they talk about buildings. And of course, from where I'm coming from, buildings is my thing. So I will not talk a lot about cultural heritage in the bigger sense. I will talk about what most planners, most lawyers, most people that sit in the room are dealing with, which is very often the built heritage. Now, as we've heard from Stacey with the duck, it comes all down to values. But the question is, what do people value? And as Stacey noted, that can be very different things for different people and cultures, and it also may change over time. So who are these people that we have? In New Zealand, we have many different cultures, and each culture values different things and aims to project their culture in different ways. Typically, heritage assessments are undertaken to determine heritage values. Due to the lack of a national standard for the identification and assessment of heritage and a consistent methodology, we have varied processes, criteria, and professional backgrounds in our assessors and councils that create inconsistencies. Therefore, it seems obvious that friction can arise as to the solidity of those assessments, and ultimately the call on why in God's name are we wanting to save that in the first place. The assessments include a range of values, and they are in various councils, combined, split up. There is a number of ways of how different councils are doing this. I have actually picked as the basis of my explanation of what these values are, the Auckland, it's based on the Auckland Council's valuations. And it starts off with the historic value, which means the place reflects important or representative aspects of national, regional, or local history, or is associated with an important event, person, group of people, or idea, or early period of settlement. So now think about buildings. Which building can fall into that category? For the social values, the place has a strong association with or is held in high esteem by a particular community or cultural group for its symbolic, spiritual, commemorative, traditional, or other cultural value. Then we have mana whenua. The place has strong association with mana whenua, but this can only be assessed by iwi. So typically on a day-to-day basis, that is actually excluded from a normal assessment. Since it's actually quite a very interesting and very diverse discussion, I think the RMLA needs to do another event on that. The knowledge value then has the potential to provide knowledge through archaeological or other scientific study, or contributes to an understanding of the cultural or natural history of New Zealand. Technological values, it demonstrates technical accomplishment, innovation, or achievement in its structure, construction, components, or use of materials. Physical attributes, it is a notable or representative example of a type, design, or style, a method of construction, craftsmanship, or use of materials, or the work of a notable architect, designer, engineer, or builder. Aesthetic value. It's notable for distinctive for its aesthetic, visual, or landmark qualities. Now, this can be very difficult to assess because what's pretty to me must not necessarily be pretty to you. Contextual value. The place contributes to or is associated with a wider historical or cultural context, streetscape, townscape, landscape, or setting. So these 8 categories show, while there are pointers where people need to go with their thinking when they assess, there is also an enormous amount of room to come up with different outcomes at the end. That's the thing, that having a national standard can guide the identification and assessment nationwide. And I think that's what we need to bring heritage to a point where more people can agree. And I'm not saying all, we will never get there. But if there is a standard and we know how we all assess our heritage against, we should be on the better road. So next time any one of you is involved with heritage and you think back on the values and think, oh, this might be one of those, maybe that falls under that. It always pays to get in contact with a heritage professional first, because the earlier you engage them in your project, the easier and smoother the way will be all the way through. Now, by the time we have now established the values, what are we going to do with them? We need to have, we need to assess their relative significance, because there's no point in having a value if you don't know where that value sits comparatively to other things, because there is one building and then there's another and another, and they might be all wonderful, but you know, we can't keep everything, therefore we need a significance rating. There are opinions in this are even more diverse. One reason for this is that most people understand the significance of heritage within their own context and how significant things are to them as individual or as a like-minded group. However, heritage that requires protection is that which provides for a larger community or a nation even a shared narrative of the past and an understanding of the community's or nation's identity. And this leads back to what Amanda was saying, that happens overseas a little bit more structured than what it is here in New Zealand. And there is where with the significance come rankings into place, and we have typically in New Zealand 2 or 3 rankings, depending on which councils you are dealing with, and they are local significance, regional significance, or national, and in some councils, local and regional are combined, so they only go on a 2-tier significance. But as Stacey has actually alerted us to, not all heritage is equal, particularly in terms of authenticity and integrity, which adds a crucial yet often overlooked layer to the heritage assessments. Accurate evaluation requires specialized knowledge of historic construction methods and materials to identify which elements are genuine. Unfortunately, much of this information isn't available in books or in old newspapers. For an accurate assessment, a knowledgeable person must conduct a detailed on-site inspection, not just a quick look from the street or Google Maps, which is frequently relied upon but is insufficient. In my experience, many buildings have been incorrectly scheduled for heritage status due to the assessments based on incomplete or inaccurate information from secondary sources and street views. This oversight often fuels criticism and misunderstandings about heritage. And I think we have got enough misconceptions and misunderstandings. We don't need to add more. Another factor to heritage that Amanda has introduced us to earlier is that heritage can and does contribute to economic well-being on a local, regional and national level. And a few examples that were investigated more recently in New Zealand and internationally for example, that in reusing heritage buildings, there's a larger labour content involved. That's 70% larger than a normal building. A reduced material cost of about 30%. The economic influence on creating higher paid jobs, because in historic conservation, you need people with higher skills than just the normal builder. If you compare that with normal buildings where you have less qualified labour, but much higher material costs, it might actually even itself out. So the myth that's out there, which is number 6 then, that heritage buildings are always expensive and it's always worse, is not necessarily true. I think if one does the economics properly, then you might find that the difference is not that big. Another point is heritage tourism, and we have that. Dunedin, everybody goes to Dunedin, not because it's so nice and cold, they go there for the buildings. That has an economic effect that is nationally as well as regionally important. And therefore, the economic effects cannot just be reduced to look at the effects on a developer alone or a building owner. If a nationally significant effect can be achieved and is identified, then it would make sense for governmental incentives to actually boost that and help out with it, so you can actually reap those economic benefits. And of course, there is the property values, which is not a simple answer, because the research we have there is quite differing. For example, in Auckland, they did in 2016, I think, the latest assessment where houses in a special character area had a 4.3% price increase, not a decrease, an increase. And even up to 50 metres outside of that special character area, the house prices were 4.3% higher than the houses beyond that. Now, that tells us that some people value living in those places. Individually scheduled buildings, on the contrary, in Auckland, and that is only an Auckland number, is a 9.6% decrease. Now, this may well have a correlation with the misconceptions of heritage, which I will come to in a minute. In Australia, for example, buildings, people see the association with owning heritage buildings as prestigious, and particular buildings with high heritage value, so therefore they are more expensive when you buy them, because people think that's a great thing to live in, and it's a status symbol. Now, where can we draw the line then? Heritage can be an old building or a new one. Heritage can be a pretty building and an ugly ruin. Heritage can be a residential building and industrial sites, landscapes and monuments. What heritage is not is a facade only. It's also not a building without authenticity and integrity. And it's also not a building because it has a stained glass windows and brickwork. This is not necessarily an indicator. So let's go back to the common misconceptions that we have. There's just a few that I threw out there, in addition to what Stacey has actually introduced us to. It does not only apply to residential villas. There's a lot more, as we've heard. It does not need to be treated like museum pieces. People say it's always costly and a difficult process. If you know what you're doing and if you know the road that will take you in the right direction, it's not that hard, but you need to engage the right people. You need to actually work with the right team. It cannot achieve what owners want. I've done that for 40 years, and in my experience, most of the time, it has always achieved what an owner wants, but also what actually was needed for heritage. But once again, you need to know what you're doing. You can't just try to actually put your own little architectural, mark on it and say, it's heritage, but it looks exactly like whatever you come up with a name. So it's also not allowed to change. No, heritage does change and needs to change. And if we look overseas, the change has actually made those buildings that are from 1420 or from 1213, they live because they have been used since then. If we don't use them and we can't make them usable for people today, then why would we keep them? And all change will result in loss of heritage value. Now, once again, if you know what you're doing, you can actually keep those values and add sympathetically and with skill, and you can have both, the best of both worlds. It's less valuable and profitable than new, as we've just heard. That is not necessarily the case either. Anyone can design heritage developments. I would say a sounding no. Cannot accommodate modern standards. I have seen many, many very old buildings that are the most highly tech buildings that you can think of. So I don't think that this is a reason for not dealing with heritage. And then the clear loss of property value, which once again we've seen might be the case, but might not be the case. So we are not necessarily agreeing to that either. And the most recent focus is the rights of property owners. Now, in conclusion, there is some food for thought for you. I'm throwing 2 ideas out that have been tested overseas, but I think we all need to actually try to think about it a little bit differently. One of them is heritage scheduling is essentially akin to property zoning. Heritage controls place limits on property rights as to other zoning provisions that are typically much less challenged. And the second one is heritage scheduling could be thought of as being akin to a luxury good, with more being spent on it as income rises, particularly in light of the figures that Amanda presented regarding the amount of scheduled items that we have and the land areas involved in New Zealand. They are certainly becoming luxury items if there is only 5 left. With that, I will close and invite you for questions. Thank you.
Nice work. Thank you, everyone. Stop that one. So here we go. We're on screen. All right. Any questions from the floor? I've got a couple if no one else does. All right. Well, yes. We'll get okay. Got the box.
Province to get there. You have to hold it quite.
Okay, is that close enough?
And then we might need. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is a question or opening up for anyone to comment on, but there's been quite a lot of direction not recently, over some time from the Environment Court to various professions to try and seek some standardisation of approaches and for assessment and classifications and various things. I'm just wondering, it was interesting to hear the different perspectives on the fact that there's quite a lot of variation through the country on how heritage is approached. I'm just wondering, has the Environment Court given any direction on that, trying to seek or encourage greater standardisation across the country?
Not to my knowledge. There is a few decisions out, and I think Mike would be the better person to know the legal background on that. There is a few decisions out where heritage, and particularly more recently, special character has been looked at in terms of council decisions and then decisions in the Environment Court. And what my experience is that even within the courts, there is often discrepancy and unclear understanding of where things need to go and what is involved, what needs to be looked at. I think, and that's the reason why I say the national standard should be a very, very pressing thing for the government to do, because that will actually resolve a lot of problems that are out there. That will actually make the courts much less busy if people can actually see what they are dealing with and everybody is playing to the same game rules.
This might be a question for Amanda, but also to anybody. It sounds like really we've got sort of RMA direction, then a bit of a dearth of direction, then regional policy statements and district plans, but we've also got the national planning standards in there. And I'm interested whether you've seen, since the introduction of the national planning standards, has that helped with the consistency? Has it narrowed it in terms of what councils are now focusing on? What kind of impact has the national planning standards direction had, if any?
I am not sure that I could say any great detail. Heritage New Zealand could probably say, but I would be doubtful that it has had that much of an impact, because it's really just providing headings. And I think most councils probably just move their existing schedules over and apply the same rules. But I couldn't definitively say. I don't know if anyone else has any views.
Has stopped the random slice of dice.
Add to that, I think it's the problem is the assessment. I think every council has their idea of they need to, keep heritage, and they have the upper level. The umbrella is working in a way. What doesn't work is actually the assessment and the consistency in what we are scheduling, why we are scheduling it, and this needs to be consistent throughout the country, because otherwise we are getting really, really confused people. Because people travel. We are not in the 1700s anymore. They are going down to Wellington or somewhere else in a jiffy and see different things and get confused and say, why is that this way? And the umbrella is the same for all of the councils coming out of the RMA. But what is not the same is actually how they apply it, what they do with it, how they assess it.
I think I do have something to add there, which is that it's not everybody thinks that there should be a consistent national approach, and I think that is a symptom of what has happened with the RMA, that it came in, and where there were matters of national importance, it was anticipated that national direction would be developed, but because it hasn't been developed, councils across the country have invested a lot of time and money in developing their local provisions. So there could be difficulties in achieving national consistency as well.
I think there's a resourcing issue with that for some councils too. But that wasn't my question. My question's probably for Heike, and I think that this slide's quite a good one to have it on. Earthquake strengthening. Do you want to talk about that? Because that can incur all sorts of costs, particularly when people want it to do some kind of adaptive reuse.
Yeah. Yes, I'm quite happily talking about earthquakes, since we don't have them up here in Auckland so often. Heritage buildings need earthquake strengthening, but as we have seen in recent earthquakes in New Zealand, it is not just heritage buildings who need that. It's every building. And I think the other problem is, for a start, there is no issue with strengthening heritage buildings. If you do that appropriately, there is about 1 million ways of, skinning that cat. You just need to do it. It costs money, but it costs money if you have a heritage building or another building. It doesn't, there's no difference in that. What the problem is, I think, from my practical point of view, is that people think earthquake strengthening, and that's with my engineering cap on, earthquake strengthening is keeping buildings upright. Earthquake strengthening does not mean that at all. Earthquake strengthening means keep a building upright until everybody is out and then come what may. And I think this is that, this is something that needs to get into people's heads a bit more, that it's not just heritage buildings, it's plenty other buildings. The CCTV building was not a heritage building, I'm sorry. And this is where the most people died. So, don't blame heritage for something that, I'm not saying you, in general, in general, people should not blame heritage for something that is not necessarily an heritage issue, but heritage makes quite nicely for the for the bad, sister. It's quite easy to do that, but it can be done with heritage buildings, no question.
Practically, and I've got clients who've been
in
that situation. So.
Yeah, and I think you're right, but I'm not necessarily sure that this is an issue of it is the heritage buildings, but I think insurances have actually found a little loophole where they can actually either not insure or charge more for something where I haven't seen from any insurance at any point in time, and I've been in that game for about 40 years now, where they have actually proven that, this is a more costly or a more difficult issue than anything else. If I can see that, I instantly will work for insurances.
Kia ora. Oh, there we go. Testing. I had some long, really sweeping question about the political economy and the identification of heritage, and I think I'll just boil it down so as not to sort of ask the universe. And I'd like to start with Stacey, actually. My question, actually, succinctly, is local heritage. It is a matter of national importance. Is it as important as nationally significant heritage? Discuss.
Ooh, an easy question then, Tanya. Where do we begin with that? I mean, I think, so this is not going to give you a definitive answer, but I think what's important here is, again, going back to that discussion of heritage values and say how the local community views these, because of course, ultimately a building might be seen as significant or important to a local group, and regardless of whether it might be a humble sort of fish and chip shop building, a shed, a meeting place. A duck. I mean, I think that could elevate it to the status of what might be seen as a nationally significant building as well.
So I think that's a really good question, Tanya, and I think heritage is a local proposition, and I think it's very confusing to people care about their local places, and they don't necessarily care about the nationally significant places, and I think it's very confusing to talk about nationally significant versus locally significant. I think people are more likely to have strong connections to the places that are in their local community.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think people will be going on the streets for, their neighbourhood much more than they would actually go for the beehive. But in saying that, I think the difference between regional and national heritage is, I think, and slightly in 2008, if I remember right, the government was deciding that Heritage New Zealand needs to actually cull their lists and only have nationally important buildings on there, that they found on the national level significant, which they did, and they culled a lot. But the point is here that I think if we have national significant buildings, then the government needs to make a step forward and help to look after them as the guardian for the whole nation. Whereas in regional or local, with regional and local heritage, I think there is always a willingness of people to pull together and save something, and even, you know, with working bees or whatever it is that they do, to actually save their own neighbourhood. So I think there is a difference in the level of care.
I mean, that's an interesting thought. Is that an argument against nationalising heritage consideration through a national policy statement? If its expression at a local level is as, if not more important?
I don't think so, because I think you can actually write that policy so that you can actually allow for those nuances in between. Those policies are not, you know, the policy should not be that only nationally important buildings or places will be looked at or protected. I think all of the potential buildings need to be looked at, but the point is that they will be slightly looked at through a different lens, because what's important for all of us New Zealanders is important on a different level. And, you know, we do need that because that's our identity. You know, if we would say we are taking rugby away tomorrow, you would see what people would think about that. But I think it's a different level of, as I say, a different level of care. And I think that different level of care and approach can be worked into a policy in a national statement.
Sorry, just an aligned thought, which is that in heritage practice, we talk about values, taking a values-based approach. And every place has unique values, and ranking's really just a shortcut or tiers. It's perhaps a necessary shortcut, not necessarily. It's just something that we do to make things easier. But given places have unique values, ranking things is nowhere near a perfect approach.
Thank you. That's good. I've got a quick one before. Yep. Is the big duck actually a problem? And if it is a problem, would you change anything?
I think the big duck is valuable because it demonstrates diversity in the values that we associate with heritage. I think it opens the conversation, Mike.
Yeah, okay. That's good. That's a good answer.
Oh, there you go.
Throw it.
Sorry, I've got the pesky question. I do apologise for arriving late, but this relates to archaeological sites and where this quite fits in, and some local authorities seem to be quite confused about this, and particularly in regard to scheduling. Archaeological sites can interface with architectural and all sorts of other heritage values, and there's a perception amongst some that, oh, it's Heritage New Zealand that takes care of that. But this is, in my view, speaking archaeologically, a dangerous position to be in as a country, undervaluing the values of archaeological sites. Sorry.
I think there's an education gap, and I think because it's very clear in the RMA that it's part of the definition. So, I mean, and perhaps it's something that national direction could address. Yeah.
Because I want to tie that back to Maori heritage and thinking about the origins of what an archaeological site actually is versus the method that you use to actually understand it. And do we need to be looking at ways to actually look at the place that the archaeological methods have uncovered or could uncover and think about classifying that way instead of as an archaeological site?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Well, we tend to call it archaeology as though archaeology is a thing by itself without the actually underlying meaning of what the place is that we are using archaeological methods to understand. Like, rather than protect it as an archaeological site.
Or as a cultural heritage place.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
but,
I'm definitely an exponent of the term cultural heritage place, maybe over and above all the other ways of slicing and dicing in a plan.
I agree.
Sorry.
I just had a question about, so under the broad definition of heritage that you've given, in the RMA setting, there seems to be quite a clear distinction between things that meet a threshold of scheduling, so that you've got that are listed as heritage places or items or landscapes. But there's also often councils define special character areas that are seen as something quite different. I just wonder if you have any comments about the distinctions, but also if it is important that there's a distinction, the confusion and the conflating of the two in how assessments are approached and how the debates are carried out. Heike, you might have some sort of ideas about that, or any of you.
Well, I think I can just start by talking. I think I can just talk about what happened in Wellington as I understand it, which maybe illustrates why it's so confusing, which is that Wellington was the first city in New Zealand to create a heritage area, and they did that in Thorndon. Don't ask me when, 80s or 90s or something. And then the city kept going. And so they identified another couple of heritage areas. And when they got to the time of doing the plan change, the council lost its mettle for some reason and they turned them into character areas.
Yeah, I think that is the crux of the problem, is that where where individual buildings couldn't be scheduled because of either not quite reaching the threshold, or because, like in Auckland, I'm aware that many years ago, there were just not enough people on the ground to go and do assessments that would actually be able to give the basis for a building to be scheduled. But we had many areas, Devonport, Mount Eden, I don't need to name them all, where there was large expenditures of heritage buildings. They were, as a group, quite valuable. Not every single building within that group was necessarily individually valuable. And so there was the area and the character precinct invented with the Plan Change 163, and that was a very long and very drawn out and very dense discussion in the days, I remember well. At the end of the day, and the question was asked then and throughout Plan Change 163, is character areas just a different way of putting, a heritage protection on something? And looking around the country, I think some places do, because they just don't have the resources and they don't have the knowledge base. Often smaller councils don't have the knowledge base to actually go through the process, don't have the money to go through the process to actually look at the buildings individually. And I think this is where the confusion comes from, because in 163 it was actually meant to be that it is character, not historic character, and character can be anything. And in every environment court hearing that I'm giving evidence, I always try to actually make sure that people understand that character can be an industrial character. Or
Also, so I've got a very different perspective, because for me, character areas are not just about buildings and about the built fabric. They're about a cohesive, and that's why they're a character area. It's about a whole collection of things. It might be a subdivision pattern, it might be the topography, it might be the vegetation, and it's the way it all comes together to create a special character. But the difficulty I have is the way it's evolved over time, is that so many people treat it like it's a pseudo scheduling of individual buildings within that area. And that's not what it was ever for most councils, was not the intention of identifying special character areas.
That's right. That's right. But it's once again, and I think that's the red line that goes through all of the things we have heard tonight. It has to do with information and education. And I think we are lacking sorely behind in New Zealand in getting more people from the ground up educated a little bit more and a little bit wider on what these things mean and why do we want them. And, you know, people have the right to say, we don't want them. You know, not everybody needs to buy into it. It's just as a nation should be able to keep the things that is that common narrative that actually binds people as a nation and their identity. But yeah, education will help a lot with that too.
Hi. So we're all talking about the current resource management framework. I just wanted to pigeon against the whatever the words are. Yeah. Any thoughts about what's coming in the resource management reform?
So there was a cabinet paper about phase 3 of resource management reform that was recently proactively released by MFE. And one of the things that cabinet agreed to was that, oh gosh, I don't know the exact word, what exactly they agreed to, but something around narrowing or considering narrowing the system. And there was some content in the cabinet paper that gave heritage as an example of where the system could be narrowed. So the Minister Bishop has appointed an expert advisory group that's currently deliberating about the shape of the new system, and they are expected to deliver a blueprint to him before Christmas, I think. And you can rest assured that the Ministry for Culture and Heritage is working hard on advice that we might give when we're asked that question about the narrowing of the system. Indeed.
Watch this space. Okay. Well, I think that's probably a very good and convenient spot to finish. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you. And I do have just a very small token of our thanks actually to present, and thanks also to Boffa School for hosting us. Couldn't do these events without them. Feel free to hang around if you want to for another drink and a chit chat, but otherwise, thanks very much for coming along.
Thank you. Really mean questions.
Oh.
No, it's a good question. Anyway, I wonder when
Oh, I just see you later. I know.